Maybe everybody is familiar with this photo. It can be seen in many places of Korea. It is also well known to the world. Today, we are going to tell you about the photo from the viewpoint of a reporter of the new generation.
Photo is the fairest witness of history. The photo we are going to talk about is also displayed on the second floor of the Central Class Education House.
여기 사진이 1944년 9월에 찍힌 사진인데 이때로 말하면 태평양 전쟁이 격렬하던 때입니다.
This photo was taken in September 1944 at the height of the Pacific War. Here in the photo, you can see women leaning against a trench in Songshan, Yunnan province of China, which was the then China-Myanmar border area. At that time, Songshan was the forefront of the Japanese army. In the area, there was 100-day fierce battle between the Japanese army and the Allied forces. After the battle, a war correspondent of the Allied forces saw miserable women who had been taken to the front line as sex slaves and took their photo.
In the photo, you can see a pregnant sex slave. Nobody knew that she would be a crucial witness, thoroughly exposing the criminal sexual slavery for the Japanese army on the world arena after 56 years.
This is the Korean Committee on Measures for the Sexual Slavery for Japanese Army and Drafting Victims.
이 사진은 미 국회 도서관에 소장돼 있었습니다. 그러다가 40년이 지나서 1984년에 세상에 공개.
This photo was kept in the library of the U.S. Congress. It was opened to the public in 1984, 40 years later. In the early 1990s, amid the mounting international criticism of the sexual slavery for the Japanese army, the photo became a typical evidence clearly showing the miserable plight of the sex slaves. But until then, nobody wondered whether those women in the photo were still alive or not. The photo was regarded as a photo of the old times and as a historical material.
그런데 바로 이 사진의 주인공들이
One day in May 2000, the Korean Committee on Measures for the Sexual Slavery for Japanese Army and Drafting Victims received a telegram and some photos sent by a non-governmental organization of Japan. To the Korean Committee on Measures for the Sexual Slavery for Japanese Army and Drafting Victims, while making an investigation for the preparations of the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery sponsored by civilians, we found out a former Japanese soldier called Hayami who survived the fierce battle of Songshan in Yunnan province of China during the Pacific War. Recollecting the Korean comfort women in those days, he testified to the fact that there was a 22-year-old woman called Wakaharu among them, and her real name was Park Yong-sim, and that the pregnant woman in the photo taken by the Allied forces was Wakaharu. Wakaharu seems to be almost similar to Park Yong-sim we met in Pyongyang last year. You are kindly asked to confirm it. May 2000.
그때 정말 우린
At that time, we were greatly surprised. We have seen the photo so many times, but we couldn't believe that the pregnant woman in the photo is old woman Park Yong-sim in our country. We wondered if she hadn't seen the photo for more than 10 years since it was open to the public, and thought that she might not have known about it as she was living in the countryside. At last, we left to meet the old woman.
Kim Chun-sil could not accompany us for an urgent business. We headed for Nampo without her.
This is Gangso district of Nampo City, where the old woman Park Yong-sim was living. Kim Chun-sil and other members of the Korean Committee on Measures for the Sexual Slavery for Japanese Army and Drafting Victims once visited it after they received a photo from the Japanese non-governmental organization.
저는 그 박용심 할머니와 이웃해서 10년 남아 같이 살았습니다. 이웃이니까 자주 이렇게 왔다 갔다 했는데 하루는 그 할머니와 텔레비 시청을 한번 한 적이 있었는데 그때 그 텔레비 화면에서는 일본 놈들이 그 재행에 대한 이런 상세한 말.
I lived next door to the old woman Park Yong-sim for over 10 years. We often saw each other.
건물 옆에는 무엇이 있었다 하면서 얘기하고 또 그 건물 뒤에서
One day, I watched television together with her and saw a program on the crimes of the Japs. Pointing to a building, she said what was beside it and what was behind it. I wondered how she knew it well.
성폭행 문제가 국제적으로
It was not until the sexual violence by the Japs was raised as an international issue that I came to know that she was born and worked off in Gangso to be assaulted by the Japs.
후에 알았습니다.
저도 그렇고 거인이 된 저희 세대도 그렇고 시어머니 과거에 대해
My dead husband and I
Park Yong-sim adopted an orphan boy after the end of the Fatherland Liberation War. This is her daughter-in-law. She said Gangso, where Park Yong-sim was living, is her native place. Park Yong-sim was born into a poor collier's family as the eldest daughter and lost her mother in her childhood. In order to support her father and two brothers, she ran errands in a tailor's shop. In this way, she eked out a scanty livelihood. One summer day in 1939, when she was 18 years old, a Japanese policeman called at the tailor's shop.
일본인 수사가 이렇게 모자 씹으러 쓰고 긴 칼 차고서 왔어요. 그럼 길에는 얼마 있다 와서 나한테 와서 가자고 해서 내가 가자는 이 시장놈 가나 가자면 가지 뭐. 너 돈 벌러 가자는데 싫니? 돈 벌러 어디 가자는 더 낭동길로 가자고.
Cheated by his lie, she went to the Pyongyang railway station together with some other girls. It is said that roughly 15 girls of about 20 had already gathered there. They were the innocent girls forcibly taken by policemen at the dictation of the Japanese military or cheated by the heads of subdivisions of villages. They were loaded on a freight train like a pack and taken to an alien land under strict watch of the Japanese army. The daughter-in-law said that, in fact, her dead husband and she herself didn't know well about the ensuing tenor of her mother-in-law's life, and that she knew it vaguely in May 2000 when members of the Korean Committee on Measures for the Sexual Slavery for Japanese Army and Drafting Victims, including Kim Chun-sil, came to her house. Back to Pyongyang, our hearts were heavy, wondering if it was right for us to keep up our coverage. Though she is dead and gone, we felt uneasy before her and her bereaved family. So we are thinking about giving it up. But another cry pounded on our hearts. It was the voice of conscience of a woman reporter of the new generation that the hidden truth should be disclosed before the history and the times. We met Kim Chun-sil again to hear more about Park Yong-sim.
그래서 우리가 그 사진 속에 임신한 여성이 할머니인지 그걸 확인하기 위해서 이 할머니를 찾았던 때로부터 벌써 20년 세월이 흘렀습니다. 정말 그 할머니에게 이 사실을 확인한다는 게 우리로서는 정말 난감하고 탁한 일이 아닐 수 없었습니다. 그래서 어떻게 할까 하고 생각하다가 할머니를 모시고 바닷가로 나갔습니다. 그래서 바다에 나가서 할머니와 함께 구경을 하면서 할머니가 그 안착되었을 때 제가 할머니에게 할머니 바다 구경 언제 처음 하셨어요?
20 years has already passed since we called on the old woman so as to confirm if she is the pregnant woman in the photo. At that time, it was quite awkward for me to meet her for such confirmation. I thought what to do and went out to the seaside with her for enjoying seascape. When she seemed to feel easy, I asked her when she had seen the sea for the first time. She said maybe it was when I was taken by the Japs to Myanmar via Singapore. We took ship and saw the sea for the first time. I asked her again, how were your hairstyle and attire at that time? She replied, bobbed hair. The Japs would cut pigtail of Korean girls that hung down to their waist. We wore an awful yellowish loose shirt and an old dark blue skirt. I cautiously said, well, a soldier of the old Japanese army survived the battle in Songshan, Yunnan of China. Looking at this photo, he said the pregnant woman had been called Wakaharu, and perhaps you...
난 아니요. 여기 내가 없어.
No, I'm not. I'm not here in the photo. Who told you so? Who?
사진을 보자마자 할머니가 갑자기 막 경륜을 잃듯이
As soon as she saw the photo, the old woman fell into sudden convulsion and went off in a faint. We were at a loss what to do. Hurriedly taking her to a hospital, we thought that she was the pregnant woman in the photo.
두는 것이었습니다.
Many years has passed since the slaves came into being in the human society, and stories about their miserable life have been registered in every page of the history. There was no precedent in history, however, that slaves were forcibly collected to satisfy the sexual desire of the soldiers on the battlefields of foreign countries under the direct sponsorship of the state. The extra-large immoral crimes of sexual slavery began to be committed in the 1920s. Since then, women were kidnapped in Korea, which resembled the medieval slave hunting. The kidnapped were not only women of about 20, but also little girls, nursing mothers, and engaged girls before wedding ceremony. They numbered 200,000. It was the immoral crimes unprecedented in the human history of wars. For decades, however, such tremendous crimes were hidden behind the thick curtain. This issue was not brought up for discussion even at the Tokyo International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which judged the top war criminals including Hideki Tojo after the Second World War. It was because Japan made every effort to cover up the details of the criminal sexual slavery for its army. They knew too well the immorality of the sexual slavery and the seriousness of their crimes committed in an organized way. But the sun cannot be covered with a palm. In early 1990, military documents and a number of records were discovered in the library of the Defense Institute under the then Japanese Defense Agency, showing that the old Japanese military had been directly and deeply involved in walking off and transporting women and setting up comfort houses.
Some months later, in August 1991, a news was reported to the astonishment of the world.
어려갖고 정말 기가 막혀요. 그 어마어마한 군인들이 달라들었고 감대로 달라들지는 정말 기가 막혀. 입사를 깨물고 도망가려고 뿌리치고 도망가려고.
The news was announced at Kim Hak-sun of South Korea, revealing that she was a victim of the sexual slavery for the Japanese army, brought a lawsuit to the Tokyo District Court against the Japanese government in demand of its official apology and compensation for the damages. The world was greatly shocked. The thick curtain was removed in an instant. Victims of sexual slavery from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, South Korea, China, and Southeast Asian and European countries continued to express their resentment and sorrow they had hidden in their hearts for decades. Even those who had served in the Japanese army gave an open evidence of their crimes before the history and the international community. But Japan was so shameless and cunning. It said, those women on the battlefields were prostitutes who had come for money-making. The government and the military had nothing to do with them at all. Those women were collected by private companies, it insisted. In order to make Japan no longer evade its responsibility, we needed a more influential testifier as Park Yong-sim. Unlike other surviving victims in the world, she was backed up by photographs, documents, materials, and witnesses proving the crimes of sexual slavery. This is Hayami, a soldier of the old Japanese army, found by a non-governmental organization of Japan. He testified that the pregnant woman in the photo taken by the Allied forces is Wakaharu. And this is the November 30th, 1944 issue of the newspaper Roundup, published for the GIs in Myanmar at the time. It also printed the same photo. The book, The Kidnappers, said, there was a 22-year-old girl called Wakaharu among the Korean comfort girls. Her real name was Park Yong-sim, and she looked firm. In addition, there was a record of the Allied forces' interrogation of Park Yong-sim.
하지만 그때 박용심 할머니가 아무리 80을 눈앞에 둔 고령이라고 할지라도 어디까지나 여성이 아니었을까요? 우리가 지난 시기 성노예 피해자들을 만나본 데 의하면 일본 놈들에게서 당했던 그 수치스러운 과거들을 되새기는 것조차 정말 죽기보다
Park Yong-sim was nearing 80 at that time. Anyhow, she was a woman. Victims of sexual slavery we met detested remembering their disgraceful past. They all wanted to keep it secret forever. The same went for the case of Park Yong-sim, I think. It would be a great pain to Park if her past planted in her heart like a time bomb is revealed. I felt heartrending.
가슴이 아팠습니다.
Park Yong-sim remembered what had happened to her after liberation. When she came back home, the villagers warmly welcomed her. She met a grateful man who married her without any condition. Officials of the knitwear production cooperative were so kind, and nobody blamed her for sterility and asked its reason. She brought a boy from the orphanage who called her mother. She became an exemplary member of the cooperative and a member of the Workers' Party of Korea. She enjoyed a happy life as a woman with her daughter-in-law and grandchildren. So she didn't want it to be known that she was the pregnant woman in the photo. But the spark hidden deep in her heart began to flare up gradually.
No, I can never pardon those Japs, our sworn enemy, who committed indelible crimes. I will indict them at any cost, no matter how precious my life and happiness may be.
Have you got a photo you showed me before? It's me. I was Wakaharu.
On November the 18th, 2003, Park Yong-sim took a train here for China to confirm the place of sexual slavery, together with the investigation team consisting of members of the Korean Committee on Measures for the Sexual Slavery for Japanese Army and drafting victims. Before leaving, she said, "Though dead, I will confirm the comfort house in which I was confined. I will prove that I was a sex slave violated by the Japs." Park Yong-sim traveled about Nanjing and Tongcheng and Songshan of Yunnan province in China for 14 days from November the 18th that year. It was a round trip of 4,000 kilometers.
바로 여기가 박용심 할머니가 끌려갔던 중국 남경의 리제향 위안소입니다. 그래서 이 한 개 구역이 전부 위안소입니다. 일본놈들이 남경을 점령한 다음에 이 민간 건물을 몽땅 다 위안소로 전환시켰습니다.
This is the Li Jixiang Comfort House in Nanjing of China, to which Park Yong-sim was taken. This one block had comfort houses. The Japanese turned all the private buildings into comfort houses after occupying Nanjing. When we came here in company with her, she was sitting in a wheelchair as she was not well. As we slowly approached the comfort house, she stared at it before wailing. "This is the very place," she said, but no more, weeping bitterly. We were at a loss what to do. We tried to go into the comfort house with her, but she refused, bursting into tears.
통곡을 하면서 계단을 하는 것이었습니다. 그래서 할 수 있습니다.
It is said that this was the only entry to the comfort house during the Japanese imperialists' occupation. The entry in front of her seemed to be a square mouth of the monster to take her back to the disgraceful past that violated her chastity and totally destroyed her body. Tears rolled down her cheeks. They were bitter tears of the miserable woman who was violated by 20 to 30, nay, more Japanese spoons, and deprived of all her chastity, youth, and rights as a woman. According to the document, in those days, this was the Li Jixiang Comfort House. When she visited it in November 2003, however, this building, once a comfort house, was being used as dwellings for citizens. Saying it was the comfort house confining only Korean women 500 meters away from the barracks of the Japanese army, she went upstairs to room number 19.
한 30평방 정도 될 것 같았습니다. 방에 들어서서 방을 쭉 돌아보던 할머니가 그저 아무 말도 못하고 침대에 주저앉아서 그 80...
It seemed to be about 30 square meters. Entering the room, she fell down without saying a word. The 80-year-old woman cried like a child, and we could not find a word to console her.
Looking around at the room with sorrowful eyes, she said to have fallen down on the floor again. The nightmare more than 60 years ago fainted her.
She wept bitterly, saying she had been beaten a lot and confined long. That day, she lamented all day long.
She came to her senses in the room of the comfort house, where she was violated as a sex slave over 60 years ago. She said to have found out the room for punishment, in which the Japanese soldiers hung the sex slaves from the ceiling to beat them.
Here is a recollection on a disgrace in the room. When we arrived at the comfort house, the Japs clothed us in their national costume, kimono, and cut our hair in Japanese style. They named me Utamaru in Japanese, and they put us in the rooms, one for each. Some time later, a Japanese soldier entered my room and sexually assaulted me. He was as mad as a March hare. As I resisted to get out of him, he beat me at random, screaming like a beast, and put his saber at my neck, threatening that he would kill me. Blood gushed from my neck, cut by the saber, to wet my whole body. We had to serve 20 to 30 soldiers a day. When we resisted even a little or were impolite, they did violence to us and in the end grabbed us by the hair to drag us to the room for punishment.
Park Yong-sim was forced to sexual slavery for the Japanese army in the Li Jixiang Comfort House in Nanjing of China for 3 years. In 1942, she was taken by ship with many other Korean women to the Ikaguro Comfort House in Lashio of Myanmar via Shanghai and Singapore. In Lashio of Myanmar, the Japanese name Wakaharu was given to Park Yong-sim instead of Utamaru in the Comfort House of Nanjing.
In Lashio, we had to serve infantrymen and tankmen. Soldiers who got violent in the battle harassed us, sometimes drunken. Sexually harassed all day long. We were too exhausted to sit up. But we had to serve the officers in the evening. If we got on their nerves even a little, they would grab us by the hair and give us a hard kick. I only shed tears, deploring myself worse than animals, and missing my hometown and parents. Yet, we could not run away or kill ourselves.
This is Songshan in Yunnan province of China, where Park Yong-sim was photographed as a pregnant woman. Songshan was called Sir as there were many pine trees. It was the border area between China and Myanmar at the time. It was the forefront of the Japanese army during the Pacific War. This is the marker of the Comfort House, which still remains in Songshan. About 1,300 Japanese soldiers were stationed in Songshan when Park Yong-sim was taken there after more than 1 year sexual slavery in Lashio of Myanmar. On the contrary, the number of sex slaves was about 10 to 20. They were harassed all day long in the air raid shelter, hearing the sound of explosion of bombs and shells. Worse still, they were forcibly taken by surgeons for blood donation. Park Yong-sim had been taken to Nanjing of China, Lashio of Myanmar, and Songshan in Yunnan province of China. The fact clearly shows that the comfort houses were set up not only in large cities like Nanjing, but also in the remote forefront area.
Park Yong-sim had already been pregnant during the 100-day fierce battle in Songshan. When they were defeated in the battle, the Japanese troops stabbed and shot the 6 slaves to death. They pushed them into the air raid shelter and threw hand grenades into it to kill them en masse. It happened sometime after Park Yong-sim came out of the air raid shelter. At that time, she was at the entrance to the air raid shelter. Hearing that the Japanese army burned its colors, she realized that it had been defeated in the battle. She quickly came out of the air raid shelter together with some other women. A few minutes later, she heard bombs exploding in the air raid shelter. Park Yong-sim and her party hid themselves in mountain, not to be discovered by the Allied forces. A few days later, they came out to a nearby river in search of food. They threw themselves down on a cornfield at the riverside and gnawed at the raw maize. They are said to have been saved by a 17-year-old Chinese boy at that time.
이때 그 운남성에서 정말
In Yunnan province, Park Yong-sim met the old man Li Zhengzao, who saved her in nearly 60 years.
At the time, I found her pregnant. She was eating a corn ear, maybe because she was very hungry. I set her at ease by saying that the Allied forces do not kill the women, but send them back home. I brought her from the cornfield. I helped her by holding her arms, since she looked exhausted. As the women were hungry, I took them to my house and served them with boiled rice, before bringing them to the place where the Allied forces were stationing. On the way, the pregnant woman bled and stopped walking so often.
This is how Park Yong-sim was sent to the Allied forces. This is a motion picture found out in the U.S. National Archives some time ago, which recorded Park Yong-sim and her party transferred to the Allied forces by Lee Zeng-za. We have to ask Japan once again, which maintained that the women had come to the battlefields for money-making. What was given to the women worked off as sex slaves. What was left to them? The newspaper roundup on November the 30th, issued for the GIs in Myanmar at that time, introduced this photo, along with an article reading, "4 Korean comfort girls had to comfort the Japanese soldiers. In addition, they had to wash the clothes of the soldiers, prepare meals, and clean the air raid shelter. They were not paid at all and never received letters from their home villages." This photo was taken after Park Yong-sim and her party were handed over to the Allied forces.
In November 2003, Park Yong-sim looked round a number of comfort houses set up directly by the Japanese military in the regions occupied by the Japanese army, which kept the Korean women. Korean women were not taken to China alone. Comfort houses were set up in Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Guam, wherever the Japanese imperialist aggressors went. "200,000 Korean women were taken to those comfort houses as sex slaves. At that time, Korea had a population of 20 million. Considering that they were the young women who could give birth to a child, except the men, little girls, and middle-aged and old women, 200,000 was not a small number. More than 142,000 out of 200,000 comfort women were killed during the period of their sexual slavery, and the survivors failed to give birth to a child afterwards. If the defeat of Japan had been delayed 10 years, almost all the young women of Korea would have been walked off as sex slaves for the Japanese army, leaving the existence of the Korean nation at stake. Park Yong-sim left her hometown Gangseul in 1939 and came back home in spring of 1946. The whole story of Park Yong-sim clearly proves that the sexual slavery for the Japanese army is the most nefarious and worst immoral state crimes of the 20th century, directly organized and carried out by the Japanese government and military, from the establishment and operation of comfort houses to the enlistment and transport of women. The Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery took place at the Gudan Hall, Tokyo of Japan, between December the 7th and 12th, 2000, amid the world's attention. This was the flag, symbolic of the tribunal. The tribunal prosecuted and tried Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, Iwane Matsui, commander of the route army to China and commander of the expeditionary force to Shanghai, Shunroku Hata, commander of the 2nd General Army, Hisaichi Terauchi, commander of the South Army, Seijiro Itagaki, commander of the 7th Route Army, Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the General Staff, Seizo Kobayashi, State Minister, Rikichi Ando, commander of the 10th Route Army and Governor General in Taiwan, and Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the 14th Route Army during the Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. It also convicted the Japanese King Hirohito, who had not been prosecuted to the Tokyo International Military Tribunal for the Far East in 1946, confirming the serious lesson of history that the immoral crimes are not prescribed. The tribunal solemnly advised the Japanese government to admit the legal liability for the criminal sexual slavery for the old Japanese army and make a thoroughgoing apology and reparation as demanded by the laws of war and the international law on humanitarianism.
일본군 성노예 범죄는 이 지워버릴 수도.
The crimes related to the sexual slavery for the Japanese army are state crimes, which can be neither effaced nor covered up. Now the Japanese authorities and historians of history insist that 200,000 Korean women went to the battlefields for the Japanese army by themselves for money-making. But it is a sophistry considering that Korea was under the strict colonial rule of Japan. The crimes related to the sexual slavery are unprecedented immoral state crimes committed by the Japanese king and the Japanese imperialist colonial ruling organs, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Japanese military, the government general in Korea, and their subordinate offices in all provinces, counties, sub-counties, and villages.
제가 이 장편 소설이 내동이 울음을 쓰게 된 것은 2000년 12월 이 세계의 양심적인 이 판사단과 검사단들이 일본 도쿄에 모여서 일본의 성노예제를 이 폭로 단죄하는 이 민간급 국제 재판을 열고 여기에서 2차 대전 후 있었던 국동 국제
In December 2000, conscientious judges and public prosecutors of the world met in Tokyo of Japan and held a non-governmental international court indicting Japan for sexual slavery and convicted the Japanese king Hirohito, who had been acquitted at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East after the Second World War. This prompted me to write a novel, 4 Pieces of Ice. Once a sentence was pronounced, it should be executed. So I made the plot of the novel that descendants of the victimized sex slaves from Asian countries gather in Thailand to punish the family of the Japanese king, and Japan itself discloses its crimes in the course of investigating the incident. The novel is an indictment against the Japanese imperialists.
생각합니다.
Park Yong-sim died in 2006. At the time, she was 85 years old.
My grandmother died with much grudge, without seeing an apology and compensation of the Japanese government.
지금까지 본 것은 일본군 성노예 범죄의 극히 일부에 지나지 않습니다. 우리가 이 편지물을 창작하는 과정에 이런 질문에도 부딪혔댔습니다. 왜 굳이 일제가 우리 조선 여성들을 성노예한 그때로부터 거의 한 세기가 되어오는 오늘에 와서까지 이 가슴 아프고 참혹한
What we said above is no more than an iceberg of the criminal sexual slavery for the Japanese army. When making this documentary, we were asked a question. Why should we recall this painful and tragic history even today, nearing a century from the day when the Japanese imperialists reduced the Korean women to sex slaves? I asked this question to myself as well. But if we cover up or ignore this painful and tragic history, it will dim in the memory of our posterity. Nay, it will be gone forever. Japan is waiting for it. Then such tragic history may be repeated.
History has already given a judgment to Japan. History does not tell a lie. Remember, if Japan ignores apology and reparation, its children and grandchildren, nay, their future generations, will feel shame through generations for the craftiness, shamelessness, and moral vulgarity peculiar to Japan. There is no prescription for the crimes of sexual slavery committed by the Japanese imperialists against humanity. The Korean nation will settle accounts with Japan to the last.
Though dead, I will prove it. History proves, and so do I. History should not be effaced.